We'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. There are no agenda changes. With that, I will ask the clerk to call the roll, please.
Mr. Westcott.
Present.
Mr. Arena.
Here.
Mr. Billich.
Here.
Mr. Boomer.
Here.
Mr. Booker.
Present.
Mr. Butita.
Here.
Mrs. Crosby.
Here.
Mr. Fellers.
Here.
Mr. Fiducia.
Here.
Mr. Gurl.
Present.
Mrs. Gorl.
Present.
Mr. Hoffman.
Present.
Mr. Kelly.
Here.
Mr. McDonald.
Present.
Mr. Neighbors.
Present.
Mrs. Red.
Present.
Mr. Salgado.
Present.
Mr. Schultz. Mr. Tassoni.
Present.
Mr. Webster.
Here.
1 absent, 19 present.
Thank you very much, Clerk Gummow. With that, I'll ask everybody to stand. I'll turn things over to Mr. Tassoni for the invocation and pledge. Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Chairman. Dear Lord, we thank you for another great day on this earth you've created. Lord, we always ask that you watch over our servicemen and women and our emergency responders that keep us safe. Lord, we ask you to help us understand that everyone is different. We have different opinions, and we ask you to help us through those situations and get along best we can. In your name, amen. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tassoni. We have no words or proclamations tonight, no public comment. Move into board member correspondence. Any comments or questions by board members? Yes, sir. Mr. Westcott.
Thank you, Chairman. I got a question for you and others. All these new signs that we're seeing around the area, what is there a cost to that? Do we have to pay for that?
Yes.
Okay, and where's that money coming from?
From the board-approved budget.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Westcott. Any other questions or comments? Mr. Arena, then Mr. Webster. Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to ask our state's attorney, there had been reports in the media several times regarding claims that the county owes money to the city of Rockford and to the landfill for overpayment. State's attorney's office, I believe, has investigated those. And in your opinion, do we owe anybody any money?
That would be something that I would discuss with you in closed session because it might be potential litigation.
So it's something that then possibly we have to budget for now, or it's something in the future? Because the way it's been presented is it's something that we have an urgent need to address budget-wise, and I'm curious, is it something that we need to address budget-wise in the near future?
I'm saying that that issue is best discussed in closed session.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, State's Attorney. Thank you, Mr. Arena. Mr. Webster.
Yep, thank you. Yep, following up on what Fred said there, if something's out of the board-approved budget, then that doesn't have to go to the board to approve it? The spending, I mean?
The board-approved budget for that particular line item ran through the proper processes, so I believe we're good on that.
Well, that's what I'm asking about the process, I guess. So is that like, almost like discretionary spending then?
The communications budget that was approved by the board, or the nominal amount of money, the few $100s, I believe this cost, was approved by the board. It was within thresholds that do not require a second board approval. The entire universe watches everything I do very closely. I can tell you they line up every day trying to find something I did wrong. And if it wasn't caught in a long process of signatures that end up going through the auditor's office, I can guarantee you if it's somehow 1 inch was not within our bounds, there would have been a documented report press conference and a whole lot of discussion about that, I'm sure. So I am 100% confident that the few $100s that we spent on that item right there was approved in the budget and follows all our current processes. I could provide more information on a follow-up. I don't have any additional information available.
Okay, I'm sure that the auditors, they don't miss anything, so I'm sure that that came across their desk, whatever. I guess I never really thought much about it, about a board budget and who controls that and who has access to the spending on the board budget. And at this point, I wonder how much money's left in the board budget.
I'd be happy to get you that information.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, we'll move on to the chairman's report. I just have one item tonight regarding the trustee program recommendation. Back 2 weeks ago, we had the R1 Planning Council come and talk about the potentially becoming the agent for the county for the trustee program. There were several speakers there that evening as well that talked about the need for us to make a change. We had a good meeting, myself, Mr. Emmert, Mr. Dornbush, and I believe there was one other person, Sarah from the State's Attorney's Office as well, with a couple of folks at the RPC today. We'll be formally recommending that we make the change in agent to the R1PC. There's some draft language that has been going back and forth between R1 and Mr. Emmert and myself. There's another volley that will be necessary. That will be ready for going to committee hopefully next week if there's room for it on agendas. I'm not exactly sure which committee agendas we want to send it to, if it's a joint committee. Whatever works for the board, I'm happy with. But that's going to be ready here in the near future. There's going to be a need for another discussion. We're not quite to a formal recommendation, but that is the direction that I want to recommend to go to the board for your approval. And it's the same process any other recommendation would be. It goes to committee, and obviously will be talked about at the committee level. I'm sure there's going to be discussions, and that's great. It should be thoroughly vetted. There'll be plenty of opportunities to ask and answer those questions, and that'll be coming in the near future. So just wanted to put that on your radar. Next item of business, announcements and communications. Clerk Emma.
Mr. Chairman, the items listed below were received as correspondence.
Thank you very much. We'll place those on file. Next item of business, consent agenda. We have the raffle report, the approval of the June 13th minutes and the layover of the June 27th minutes. May I please have a motion to approve the consent agenda? Thank you, Mr. Hoffman. Second by Mr. Fellers and Mr. Billick. Any discussion on the consent agenda? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Consent agenda passes unanimously. Next item of business, any department head updates? Seeing none, we'll move on to our next item, standing committee reports. Economic Development Committee, making, I believe, his debut presentation, our new Economic Development Committee Chairman, Jazz Billick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tonight we have 4 resolutions up, and we're going to start with a resolution authorizing participation in abandoned residential property municipal relief program grant.
So we have a resolution authorizing participation in the abandoned residential property municipal relief program grant. Motion by Mr. Billick. May I have a second, please? Second by Mrs. Red, Mr. Gurl, Mrs. Gorel, and Mr. Westcott. Thank you. Item is now before the board. Any discussion, any questions by board members on item 2 under Economic Development Committee? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much, Mr. Billick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next resolution is a resolution authorizing participation in home accessibility program grant.
We got a motion by Mr. Billick on the resolution authorizing participation in the home accessibility program grant. May I have a second, please? Mr. Hoffman, thank you. Mr. Neighbors, Mr. Arena, Mrs. Red. Any discussion by board members on this item? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much, Mr. Billick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next resolution is a resolution allocating $5,000 of the host fee allocations for fiscal year 2019 to Keeping Families and Communities Together, KFACT.
Got a motion by Mr. We got a motion by Mr. Billick on the allocation of $5,000 of host fees for fiscal year 19 to keeping to KFAC. May I have a second? Thank you, Mr. Girls. Second by Mr. Fellers and Mrs. Red. Item is now before the county board. Any questions or comments? Seeing, oh yes, sir, Mr. Billick.
I'm sorry. I would actually like to request, I know that there was some people with some questions in regards to this, and I think that it would be very pleasurable to the rest of the county board to know that their host fee funds were so beneficial to this group. I think if it pleases you guys, or if, as a suggestion, if anybody wants to make a motion for a layover, so this way they can present for us at the next county board meeting or whenever they're available.
Would you like, just so I understand, do you want to refer it back to your committee for discussion or relay it over to the next board meeting, whatever you'd like to do, sir?
I would suggest a layover to the next county board meeting and have them come up here and present for us and how it's worked for them.
So we got a motion by Mr. Billick to lay over this item to the next board meeting, a second by Mr. Kelly, Mr. Westcott. The motion and second is to lay over the KFAC resolution, and that would give us apparently time to ask KFAC to come in and present at the next board meeting if that could be logistically worked out. So the motion before you is to lay over. A yes vote would allow you to lay over this item. A no vote would leave it before the board this evening. All those in favor of laying over the KFAC resolution signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? No. We have 3 board members who are a no vote to the layover: Mr. Fellers, Mr. Neighbors, and Mrs. Crosby, and Mrs. Red are all no votes. All other board members present cast a yes vote. That means we will lay this over, and I will ask Tiana if we could reach out to KFAC and get them coordinated to come in 2 weeks to present about their program. So thank you very much, Mr. Billick.
And lastly, what we have is a resolution adopting the Winnebago County Economic Development Business Incentive and Host Fee Program Policy.
We got a resolution by Mr. Billick on adopting the county development, business incentive, and host fee program policy. May I have a second? Mr. Fellers. Second, Mr. Arena and Mrs. Red. Item is now before the board. Any discussion on this resolution? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much, Mr. Billick.
That is all. That concludes our...
Thank you very much, Mr. Billick. Next item of business, Public Safety Committee, Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Chairman. Public Safety Committee has one item, resolution. It's a resolution approving an intergovernmental agreement between County of Winnebago and the Winnebago Sioux Fire Protection District. And this is for the Sheriff's Department to provide tactical medical response for SWAT callouts.
Got a resolution by Mr. Booker, motion by Mr. Booker to adopt a resolution approving an IGA between the county and Winnebago Sioux Fire Protection District. May I have a second? Several hands up. Mr. Hoffman, Mr. McDonald, Mr. Boomer, Mr. Billick, Mrs. Red. Item is now before the county board. Any discussion or questions on this item for public safety? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much, Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Chairman. And one other item is Mr. Vedra, Superintendent of the Winnebago County Juvenile Detention Facility, reporting for the month of June. Their daily average population is 42, and average length of stay is 18 days. And my apologies that I didn't get a report from Mr. Redmond from the Sheriff's Department on our jail population. And that concludes my report, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Booker. Next item of business, Personnel Policy Committee, Mr. Fiducia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have 3 items, or 3 points tonight to go over. First one is a ordinance which has been read in. That ordinance is creating section Chapter 2, Article Division 7, Chief Human Resources Officer. I so move.
We have a motion by Mr. Fiducia on the ordinance creating sections of Chapter 2, Article 3, Division 7, Chief Human Resource Officer. of the County Code of Ordinances. May I have a second? I have a second by Mr. Boomer and Mr. Webster and Mrs. Gorel and Mrs. Red. Item is now before the board for discussion or comment. Mr. Butita.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment I'd like to add, reading that the Chief Human Resource Operating Officer will develop and implement a county-wide performance management system. The system should ensure that following key areas are included: performance planning, ongoing employee feedback, employee input, employee evaluation, and employee performance review. So I'd so move that.
We got a motion by Mr. Butita on the amending the original motion, a motion to amend with that language. May I have a second? I say I have a second by Mr. Fellers, Mr. Arena. Any discussion on the amended motion that Mr. Butita just read in and was seconded? Mr. Butita, would you like to speak to that?
Yes. This was the after reading the Baker-Tilly report, their last finding, number 22, indicated that this would help. This was like a best business practice. It also would help professionalize dialogue and communication within the county up and down the management ranks. So I think it's a good thing to list as a duty for this new position, and it should help the county.
So this is separate from voting to approve. This is a vote to amend the ordinance with the language Mr. Butita read in. I see a follow-up. Thank you, Mr. Butita. Mr. Hoffman.
Thank you, Chairman. I don't disagree with those qualities, but wouldn't that be more of a job description rather than, I mean, that should be in the job description, I would think.
I will direct that back to Mr. Butita, who made the motion. Mr. Butita.
Excuse me, maybe I didn't read it correctly then. I'm amending Article 3, Division 7, which is the Chief Human Resource Officer, Section 2, duties. So it's an addition to the duties.
So we have a motion and a second to amend the duties under the CHRO ordinance that is before the board. A yes vote would amend the ordinance. It would not pass or fail the ordinance. It would just amend the ordinance. A yes vote amends the ordinance as Mr. Butita has laid out. A no vote would leave the ordinance as originally read in. And either way, we would vote to approve the ordinance in a separate vote. We're clear on that? Any questions or follow-ups on the amended motion in second that started with Mr. Butita? All those in favor of amending the ordinance signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed to this amendment? We've unanimously amended the motion. We have an amended motion before the board for approval. Any discussion about the amended motion before the board? Yes, Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm glad this amendment passed to more broaden the responsibilities of this position. However, I'm going to stick with what I originally said. I think human resources, we need a higher level overlooking things, but I think it doesn't warrant one person for that position. I think the county would be better off hiring another administrator level who has significant HR background. That's the reason I'll be voting no for this tonight. But somebody overseeing HR is also a positive thing. Don't misunderstand my vote.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Mrs. Crosby, then Mr. Fellers. Mrs. Crosby.
Is it appropriate that I add another amendment here, or do I wait for this to be voted on a second time?
If there is a motion to amend, I would make that motion to amend right now, because once we vote to approve, we've approved it. So if there's a motion, go ahead, Mrs. Crosby.
Okay, I would like to amend Section 2 under duties and delete paragraph O and paragraph P, because the statement is very broad. Wait till see if I can get a second.
Could you read in those two items?
Yeah.
Just so we're clear?
I would like to delete O, may perform functions of the county administrator in absence of same. I would like to delete P, participate on committees and special projects, and seeks additional responsibilities.
So the motion by Mrs. Crosby is to delete those items, and please repeat the letters the items fall under.
Section 2, duties, O as in Oliver and P as in Paul.
Deleting O and P. May I have a second to that motion? I have a second by Mr. Kelly and a second by Mr. Fellers. The amended motion is to delete items O and P. Any discussion? A follow-up by Mrs. Crosby.
Rationale is after I read a memo from Kim Ponder today, I was amazed at the amount of work capacity that that department does, and I can't see an individual coming in that can do all the way through P. If this person has to do additional stuff, they won't have time to go to the bathroom. That's my rationale.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Crosby. Any other comments? The item before the board is another amendment, a second amendment, and that is to delete items O and P. We're not voting to approve, we're voting to amend. This amendment would delete from Mr. Butita's amendment items O and P. Mr. Webster and then Mr. Arena. Mr. Webster.
Yeah, I think that the title alone, if we did a search for a Chief Human Resources Officer, that person, by the time you got done with the search for that person, you would wind up getting the best of the best. And if that were the case, then I think that person would be very capable of handling the job, as has already been outlined there, and still have time to go to the bathroom, probably twice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Webster. The amended motion before the board is to take Mr. Butita's motion that is passed and to delete O and P from it. There's been a motion and a second. That's what's before the board. It's the amendment of deleting O and P. We're not approving. We're just looking to see if the board wants to amend it a second time. And I did miss a hand. Was it Mr. Arena is next? Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My concern with deleting these is they're not obligations for this position. They just give them the opportunity. So may perform functions of the county administrator in absence of same. You know, we have a situation right now where we have a change in the county administrator. This would just make it permissible for this person to fill in some of those duties. And, you know, P may not be necessary to specifically be put in here, but I don't see any problem with creating some opportunity for this person to have additional responsibilities. Obviously, if that situation comes up, we would be discussing it. So, with all due respect, I think I would be voting against this amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other hands up? Mrs. Gorel.
Thank you, Chairman. I think I'm going to be against both amendments. The reason for that is what we're doing is we're opening it up to the public to come in and to apply for that position. This company can also apply for that position. And let us look at all of them in a broad sense rather than starting to nitpick here, there, and everywhere. We truly need to have more opportunities of getting the best that we can possibly get. And I would like to see us just go with the ordinance right now, which is giving us the permission to search. And we'll start there. And whoever wants to apply, even if this company wants to apply for that position, so be it. But let's leave it, the ordinance the way it is, and let's get all the information we can from anyone who would like to have this position and is qualified. There's a lot of qualifications that have to go into this. And so we want the best person to do this particular job of administrator. Thank you.
So just to clarify, we've amended the initial motion or initial ordinance that was brought in this evening that came out of committee and then it laid over from board meeting to board meeting, was amended with Mr. Butita's language. So that's what the board is currently voting on. Mrs. Crosby made a motion. It was seconded to amend Mr. Butita's motion or his ordinance in removing O and P. So we've already dealt with Mr. Butita's is what's current. Mr. Butita's is what's current. The motion and the second by Mrs. Crosby is to remove items O and P, which would a second time amend the ordinance. A yes vote is affirming and would amend the ordinance a second time and would delete O and P. A no vote would leave Mr. Butita's amended ordinance intact. Any other questions on what's this amended ordinance has, or anybody want to speak to it? So again, a yes vote amends the ordinance a second time. A no vote would leave it status quo with Mr. Butitas. Mr. Gurl.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm reading through this, and I don't see a starting salary. Do we have an idea? Are we just gonna, was there a salary that was brought up by anybody? Are we just gonna?
A point of order, Mr.
Point
Fellers.
of order on the,
we
yeah,
need to-
amendment.
We're talking about the amendment first before we go back to the rest of the rest.
Right.
The rest.
So I think.
My apologies.
No, that's okay, Mr. Gurl. I think you asked a very good question, and if it's okay with you, sir, we'll come back to that after we deal with this amendment. Whether it goes up or down, we'll come back to you first for follow-up there. Any other questions? Again, a yes vote eliminates O and P from the duties. A no vote leaves it status quo with Mr. Butita's ordinance. We clear? Okay, all those in favor of amending the ordinance a second time and removing O and P signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? No. Roll call, please.
Okay, this is for removing O and P. Mr. Arena.
No.
Mr. Billich.
No.
Mr. Boomer. Mr. Booker.
No?
Mr. Butita.
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby.
Yes.
Mr. Fellers.
Yes.
Mr. Fiducia.
No.
Mr. Gurl.
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel. Mr. Hoffman.
No.
Mr. Kelly.
Yes.
Mr. McDonald.
No.
Mr. Neighbors.
No.
Mrs. Red.
No.
Mr. Salgado. Mr. Tassoni.
No.
Mr. Webster. Mr. Westcott. Motion fails.
Motion fails. Thank you very much for the discussion. So the item before the board is Mr. Butita's amended motion. Any discussion? I'm going to go back to Mr. Gurl first, and then if it's okay, Mr. Salgado. I believe Mr. Gurl's question was salary range related to this position. Could somebody speak to that, Mr. Fiducia?
I haven't discussed, or I haven't been privy to a salary range, but I am confident that it would probably be in at least the 120s.
And do we have-
Typically, go ahead, Mr. Gurl.
Thank you. And do we have budget? Is there money in the HR budget for this? Or would there be a position or two that would be eliminated to provide for this new position? To the best of your knowledge.
To the best of my knowledge, I believe this is coming from the administration budget, and this would cover the person that this would cover the Carla's second in command. There was a second in command. I believe she felt that this was more important to have this position than that operations person. I may be incorrect. I may be speaking out of terms on that, but that's what I believe. I'm not certain.
Thank you, Mr. Fiducia. Follow-up, are you good, Mr. Gurl?
Just one quick one. Thank you,
Yes, sir.
Chairman. Just, Mr. Fiducia, if you could, with the search for a new administrator, if a new administrator came in and chose to do things differently and eliminated this position, would we, as a board, listen to that, or would we keep this position no matter what? I know with Carla's departure, there may be a new administrator in there that may see things differently and may want to go a different route.
You're asking my opinion on this, or?
Please.
In my opinion, this is an important position, and I didn't realize how important it was until I got to researching it a little bit. But certainly, if a new administrator came in and felt there was a need, ordinances can be changed also. But I would not think that a new administrator would come in and not see, if it was a professional, would see a, important need for that position. So like I said, we can always amend, or we can undo what we've done, but I wouldn't see a need to do that at this time, in my opinion.
Thank you, Mr. Gurl. Thank you, Mr. Fiducia. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to make a motion to send this back to committee. And the simple fact that questions arise with salary, different duties, obligations under the chief HR resource person. So I'd ask that this go back to committee, hash those things out, and get those answered. As considering with the sickage internal report, with all the things potentially of restructuring or reorganizing the HR, it makes sense to kind of take it back and make sure we are, aligning things properly, processes, whatever the case may be. Same thing with the personnel aspect of it. And one of the things that I've said in the past is maybe we outsource some of the things. One person may know quite a few things here, but there's other things too that need to be focused on. So I think if we send it back to committee, and that's why I'm making this motion, if I can do so at this time, to send it back to committee.
I'm going to ask a follow-up, and I'm accepting your motion, of course. Motion to send this back to committee, but let me ask you, Mr. Salgado, are you making a motion to send this back to personnel and policies, or are you making a motion to send this because of financial matters to finance and personnel policies?
Personnel policy would be where it started, and that's where I would send it back.
The motion by Mr. Salgado is to send this to the Personnel and Policy Committee, refer it back to committee. May I have a second? We have a second. Mr. Kelly, Mrs. Crosby, Mr. Fellers. I'm sorry if I missed somebody. Mr. Gurl, Mrs. Red. Did I miss anybody? So now we have a motion and a second to refer this back to committee, the Personnel and Policy Committee in which it originated. Is there any discussion on this motion by Mr. Salgado, Mr. Fellers?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is it working?
It's on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with Mr. Salgado's motion on this, but more importantly, I'd like to see kind of personnel and policy sit on this for a little bit in committee. Our two chief priorities right now have to be hiring both a county administrator and a CFO. If Mr. Fiducia is correct, and this budget was from the second in command, which essentially was the CFO position, we need a CFO before we need a CHRO. We need a county administrator before we need a CHRO. So I would say, if we send this back, I would ask the Personnel and Policy Committee to sit on this for a little while. Let's get the appropriate people in place, focus on our budget, focus on the administrator, focus on the CFO, and then we can take this up again once we have someone new and a new strategy in place. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fellers. I saw a couple hands pop up. Mrs. Gorel first and Mr. Arena. Mrs. Gorel.
Thank you. Am I reading this wrong? Isn't all this saying to us is we get permission to go forward and look for an administrator? It's not hiring somebody right now. All this is saying is that we will have the right to go forward, then we can do the contracts, whatever we have to do, but it gives us the right to actually start a search. Am I wrong on that?
I'll speak to it, and then if anybody wants to clean it up, Mr. Fiducia, you're welcome to. Anyone else? This vote is to establish it in our code. Establishing the position in the code. That's what it is. That is what your vote is to take the amended motion, Mr. Butita's amended motion, and establish that in the code. A follow-up, Mrs. Gorel. Did I say that correctly, Mr. Fiducia?
Yes, if I could add on to that.
Go ahead.
Chairman Haney has said that correct. We're creating the position. That doesn't mean that we have to fill it. Okay, it means that the slot is there. It can sit there for, there's other positions out there that are sitting there empty. This one could sit there until we have the resources or the things in place to do this. I would say that this is just to get the position out there and maybe start looking, I think would be good. I don't want to sit there and say, okay, we're going to go out and look for a human resources director and not have a position ready. If we have a position, or at least we can go out and start looking a little bit.
Thank you, Mr. Fiducia. I think the next person was Mr. Arena, then I believe Mr. Webster. Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to agree with Mr. Fiducia that all we're doing today is creating the position. I think it's to our advantage to begin the search for these positions after we have a new administrator in place. Then that person would be involved in the ultimate selection of these positions. And to the question of salary, at the there's like a last paragraph of the memo that might not have been noticed, but Ms. Pascal says that the similar positions in the local area have a salary of from $100,000 to $120,000. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Arena, for the follow-up. Before I go to Mr. Webster, I've heard two different things, though, and I want to make sure there's clarity on the board floor. What I heard from you, Mr. Arena, is that this position could be established and that you made a comment that the administrator position could be filled, and then that basically what I heard from you was some logistical delay in the CHRO. What I heard from Mrs. Gorel, though, or what I believe I heard from Mr. Fiducia, was that you could commence searching immediately. And I think if we're talking about sending something back to committee, which is a time element, if I've not heard things correctly, let's be clear, but I heard one that talked about a delay if established, and one perspective that said we would commence search immediately. And I'm not assigning good or bad to it. I'm just making sure I'm clear on what the intention is. Can I go back to you, Mr. Arena?
Yes, thank you. I'm suggesting that it's in our best interest to establish the position now. We can begin searching for potential candidates. Hopefully, we'll have a new administrator, and then that administrator would be involved in selecting the person. Now, that's just my perspective on what's the best way to proceed. If the rest of the board feels we should delay searching for candidates, that's another possibility. But it causes no harm for us to establish the position. We could establish it and never fill it. But at least once it's established, we have it there as an option. And I think we should go ahead and move forward. And so I am opposed to sending it back to committee.
The motion and the second is to send this back to committee, and I'm sorry, Mr. Webster.
Thank you. Mr. Arena, he said it perfectly there, and so did Mr. Fiducia. This has given us the ability to create this position. It doesn't say anywhere here that we're going to do this immediately. It doesn't say what it has to be done. It says we're creating a position. And once again, as these guys pointed out, that position could remain open until just the right person came along. But there's no point in us having to say that just because we passed this ordinance, that we have to put out feelers to fill this position right now immediately. I agree with what Paul said. Getting a new administrator in there first and letting that administrator sit in on the hiring process as well, I think is extremely important. So therefore, I think we should move forward with at least creating this position. We're not voting on hiring anyone tonight, just voting on creating the position. Thank you.
Just to follow up, Mr. Webster, so I understand, are you saying that if there would be a scenario, and who knows, if there would be an acting administrator versus an administrator, if there would be an interim administrator, are you saying that you would want to see the administrator, or the acting administrator get in, or a county, the full-time hire get in, or are you not distinguishing either way? I'm just trying to understand.
I'm saying that you're getting things too twisted up here. And all I'm saying is that it's just creating a position, and an administrator that is going out the door, so to speak. No, we wouldn't do that search then. We were going for someone, then we would go with someone, an administrator that we know is going to be there and have more stability.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to be crystal clear on this because I'm not opposed to creating this position or not, but what I've heard two amendments already today was the duties and responsibilities of that code. So from my perspective, I'm hearing different dissenting points of view of what that person should be doing. So from my perspective, this is why I wanted to go back to committee, so we can establish that based on why this came out of committee in establishing a chief human resource person. That's why I'm sending it back. I want it to go back, so we're crystal clear on it. I don't want to be here debating 30 hours or whatever and having 30 amendments because I feel that maybe they should take out the trash or something like that as part of their ordinance or their job description or what they're going to be doing. That's why I want it to go back. There's questions about budget as well. Yeah, it's going to be 120, whatever the range may be. Do we have, where's the money coming from? When you're writing this, that has to kind of be incorporated in that. And that's what I'm hearing today. And that's why I want it to go back to committee. Not because I don't want the position or that we don't need it, because from the Sickich report, there's things that need to be corrected. But at the end, we have to do it right the first time. We can't leave holes in there. Sure, we implement it, things may not work, we need to readjust, we realign it. But let's do the leg of the work up front, and then if we need to come back and do it again, we do so. That's why I'm sending it, I want it go back to committee. I know that it's been laid over like 2-3 different times, but I wonder why. Why are we still having questions? So I want it to go back to that committee for fine-tuning, whatever you want to call it, so we have the answers to our questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Salgado. I think Mr. Grill was next, then Mr. Hoffman, then Mr. Boomer. Mr. Grill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Salgado brings up a great point. If there is no time precedence on this and we're just reading it in and we want this in our code of ordinances, let's take some time and make sure that this position is something that the board can agree upon, that we do and are financially stable to bring on someone at $120,000 range. You're talking millions of dollars over years with legacy cost. At a time where the county is struggling to fix roads. Granted, we do need changes in our human resource department. We need better implementations of policies, procedures, but this should be something that we can discuss at committee, get something right, and then bring it in and put it into our ordinances, not kind of rush this through and then go back at it. But let's do it right. I'm in favor of the position. I'm just wanting everyone to be on the same page as far as what this is. And so if there's no time frame to get this in here, you know, we're still looking at weeks before our administrator is gone and then define an interim. So I think the time is with us on this one. So I would urge you to send this back to committee so we get it right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Grill. Mr. Hoffman defers to Mr. Boomer. Mr. Boomer.
Okay, so Mr. Salgado's the head of the finance. He should know that there's money left in the administration budget to hire this. So I don't understand why he's saying it, send it back to committee. And it's the second reading, not the third reading, so we're following the rules. We're not rushing through this, Mr. Goro. So as far as I'm concerned, let's vote this thing and be done with it.
Thank you, Mr. Boomer. I got a follow-up by Mr. Salgado and then a follow-up, I believe I'm in the process of Mr. Fellers. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Boomer, I haven't heard anything where this money was going to come from. I believe Mr. Girl asked the question where the money was coming from. Mr. Fiducia kind of answered the question. So I haven't heard where the money's coming from. So I just want that for the record. Maybe it was spelled out in the committee, the personnel committee, whatever the case may be. I'm aware of it. I just want it for the record that just because I'm the finance chair doesn't mean that I know everything there is when it comes to every single transaction that occurs. No disrespect to Mr. Boomer, but I just want that for the record on that notion. And Mr. Girl did ask the question, and the question was not answered. I think it's in the 120 range. Okay, that's fine. Where's the money? Do we have the budget? Where's it going to come from? And have we allocated the funds that, are we doing that for this budget cycle? So once again, send it back to committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Salgado. Mr. Fellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just to jump on what Mr. Salgado said, I mean, even if it seems like we're not going to hire someone in this fiscal year, it doesn't hurt us to send it back and talk about it some more, make sure we really do get it right. Not only that, but that means if we go into next year, when we look at next year's budget, we are going to budget for a administrator at 120 plus a year, going to budget for a CFO at 120 plus a year. Now we're adding another 120 potentially for a CHRO. And again, back to what Mr. McDonald had said recently, said before, two extra people in the HR office might be significantly more valuable at $60,000 a pop than one person overseeing everything at $120,000 a pop. I don't even think we know the answer to that question, and I think that we need to be fully staffed up in the administrator and CFO positions before we can even consider that. So there's no harm in setting this back and just waiting a little bit more, tweaking it out, making sure it's right, and then figuring out what the right step forward is.
Thank you. Did you have something, Mr. Fiducia?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't mind if it goes back to committee, not a bit, but this item has been before the board now for 6 weeks, and I thought we would have ample time to look at this and vet our questions out. That's why I'm not going to support sending it back to committee. However, the comments that were made were all valid, and I understand that, but this was 6 weeks that this is in front of this board, and I feel we should have, if you had questions, you should have done that and got it done and come to either Mr. Boomer, the administrator, or myself and asked these questions, and I heard none. So that's why I'm not going to support it going back.
Thank you, Mr. Fiducia. Mr. Butita.
Thank you. I'm going to support the position. I think at the HR position in our government is a very important position, and we need a strong person there. So I'll support moving it forward. I think the argument that needs to be made, though, from my observation, is that we should discuss the staffing within a department. After reading the Baker-Tillery report and after reading Carla's analysis of the chief human resource officer and the human resource director and all the responsibilities that were lying down, it became very evident to me that that department was understaffed. So I support the position, but I think the discussion should move on to the staffing of that department.
Thank you. The item before the board, so we don't get lost in the productive conversation, is a motion to send this back to committee. A yes vote sends it back to the Personnel and Policy Committee. A no vote keeps it right here on the board floor for a final vote this evening. Any other comments? I see a hand up, Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to say for the record, I did attend the Personnel and Policy Committee when it was discussed there, and Ms. Pascal did say in that meeting that the funds were available in the administration budget to fill this position. So she had already addressed it and feels the money is there. Thank you.
Just to follow up to that, in the administration budget, I believe $100,000 was set aside for an operations officer in this year's budget that the board approved. That has not been filled, so that $100,000 would be there. That's sitting in this fiscal year budget. Just to be clear, so that would be, I believe it's 100, not 120, 130, or any other number. I believe it's right at that 100 range. Any other follow-ups, Mrs. Gorel? Again, the motion is to send back to committee or not.
Thank you, Chairman. No, I won't send it back to committee. I hope you all realize that as of August 2nd, we will not have an administrator who's going to take over all those duties and be in place for what's coming up in the future. Not only will we be losing an administrator, we're going to be losing our chief officer of finance. So you really can't just continue to drag this along and drag it along and drag it along. The whole thing is getting to be ridiculous. Get to the point, people. We're going to have to replace this person. We're going to have to replace the administrator. You want to call it an operations person? I call it an administrator. And as of August 2nd, we're all going to be hanging out to dry to figure out who's going to be doing what. So get your heads together and get this thing done so we can at least have it on record that this ordinance, we will be having an administrator, and we have the right to employ one. Thank you, and I call the question.
We have then at the end a motion to call the question, which would force the vote on the amended motion to refer to committee. May I have a second on the calling of the question that would end discussion? We got several. I'll go with a couple. Mr. Kelly, Mr. Westcott. All those in favor of calling the question signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed to calling the question? We've unanimously called the question, so we will end debate. The item you're voting on is not to pass or establish this position. It is to send it back to committee. A yes vote sends it back to committee. A no vote keeps it right here on the board floor for action tonight. And with that, since we've ended discussion on this item, I will ask the clerk to call a roll. And again, a yes vote sends it to committee. A no vote keeps it right here. Clerk, come out.
Mr. Billich? No. Mr. Boomer? No. Mr. Booker?
Yes.
Mr. Butita?
No.
Mrs. Crosby?
Yes.
Mr. Fellers?
Yes.
Mr. Fiducia?
No.
Mr. Gurl?
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel?
No.
Mr. Hoffman?
No.
Mr. Kelly?
Yes.
Mr. McDonald?
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors?
No.
Mrs. Red?
No.
Mr. Salgado?
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni?
No.
Mr. Webster?
No.
Mr. Westcott?
No.
Mr. Arena?
No.
It's 12 noes.
Motion failed. So the item is before the board for action tonight. Are there any other comments? I just want to clarify one thing just so that I'm aligned with Mrs. Gorel's comments. The comment around there being $100,000 currently in the administration budget, it was initially slotted for an operations person. That does not mean that that's separate from there being a soon-to-be open county administrator or the discussion that was raised on the board floor about the need to split out the county administrator and a CFO. Just so I'm clear and I'm not in any way misunderstood, and that you're understood as well. Any discussion by board members? The item before the board is the establishment of the amended motion, Mr. Butita's amended motion to establish the CHRO position. Mr. Boomer.
Call the question. Call the question.
We have a motion by Mr. Boomer to call the question, which would end discussion. May I have a second? Several seconds, Mr. Westcott, Mr. Hoffman. All those in favor of calling the question signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? We have called the question. We've ended discussion. The amended motion by Mr. Butita to establish the CHRO position is before the board. A yes vote will establish this in the ordinance. A no vote will not establish it in the ordinance. And with that, I will ask the clerk to call the roll, please.
Mr. Boomer?
Yes.
Mr. Booker?
Yes.
Mr. Butita?
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby?
No.
Mr. Fellers?
No.
Mr. Fiducia?
Yes.
Mr. Gurl?
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Kelly?
No.
Mr. McDonald?
No.
Mr. Neighbors?
Yes.
Mrs. Red?
Yes.
Mr. Salgado?
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni?
Yes.
Mr. Webster?
Yes.
Mr. Westcott?
Yep.
Mr. Arena?
Yes.
Mr. Billich?
Yes.
$15 yes, motion passes.
Motion passes. We've established a CHRO position. Thank you very much for the discussion, Mr. Fiducia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next item is an ordinance to be laid over. This ordinance is amending sections 1, 2, 3 of the County Code of Ordinances, and I want to read this in for a first reading this evening.
Thank you very much. Mr. Reno.
I move that we suspend the rules and vote on this tonight. It's a time-sensitive issue.
We have a motion by Mr. Arena to suspend the rules, which would allow us to vote this evening on this ordinance. Second by Mr. Boomer. Item is now before the board. The motion is to suspend the rules. Any discussion on to suspending the rules or not? Mr. Fellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I mean, this is not a time-sensitive issue. We can move forward on this. I mean, this is just personnel and policy making another run at the chairman's position. Every time they find a role the chairman has to do, we want to push this off. And now we didn't. We had a committee meeting on Monday. We're going to vote for it on Thursday, which is everyone on this board said we didn't want to do. So no, we don't suspend the rules, and we let this lay over.
We got a motion and a second to suspend the rules. If we suspend the rules, we could take action this evening. Again, only the discussion at this point is whether or not to suspend the rules or not. If we suspend, we vote this evening. Any discussion? Seeing none, I'll ask the clerk to call the roll. A yes vote will suspend the rules.
To suspend?
Yep.
Okay, Mr. Booker?
Yes.
Mr. Butita?
No.
Mrs. Crosby?
No.
Mr. Fellers?
No.
Mr. Fiducia?
Yes.
Mr. Gurl?
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel? No. Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Kelly?
No.
Mr. McDonald?
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors?
No.
Mrs. Red? Mr. Salgado?
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni?
Yes.
Mr. Webster? Mr. Westcott?
Yes.
Mr. Arena?
Yes.
Mr. Billich?
Yes.
Mr. Boomer?
Motion passes. We've suspended the rules. The item before the board is the ordinance.
Is it a majority vote, or is it a majority for this, for suspension?
How many votes did we have?
13 to 6.
I believe to suspend, it requires how many, Mr. Kurlinkus? 12?
19 present, the suspension would require 12.
Yep. So motion passes. We've suspended the rules. The item before the county board is the ordinance change to section 2 of the code related to the appointment of the county administrator. Any discussion by board members? Yes, Mr. Fellers.
Thank you. Who will be if we make this change, who will be appointing the next county administrator?
In the ordinance, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but the ordinance states that is before the board that it would go to the Personnel and Policy Committee. Is that correct, Mr. Fiducia?
I believe that would be the way it would go, but it would then go to the entire board, so the board would be the ultimate person, to the ultimate body, where the end subject to hire this person. And the person is working for you guys, so that's the way I feel it should be.
So we're gonna give this to the Personnel and Policy Committee, the same Personnel and Policy Committee that changed the ordinances multiple times since January, put us in a position where we gave all of the power in this county to one person, and then that one person just quit and left us hanging out to dry. Why should we trust you guys to make a good decision?
Point of order, you don't have to get personal, Mr. Fellers.
That wasn't personal, that was professional.
Moving on. Any other comments? Mr. Fiducia would like to speak to that.
I have nothing to say here.
Mr. Boomer.
Okay, so basically it just changes from the chairman who is going to resign, which he's vocally said, to the board, or not gonna run, sorry, to the board appointing the administrator, who most of these people on the board are gonna have to be dealing with the administrator. So why should the chairman appoint the administrator when most of this board will still be here having to deal with the new administrator. That's all it is. It changes one sentence in the ordinance, from the chairman to the county board.
So just to follow up to that, Mr. Boomer, so the thrust of the change is that because I'm not running for reelection, that it precipitates the need to have that.
Well, correct.
Yet we do not know who all will be part of a future board as well, because half of our board will be up for reelection. So I just wanted to point that out as well. That's not my opinion, that's actually a fact. Mr. Salgado.
Yes, I don't view it that way as Mr. Boomer, but I view it as essentially the county administrator now reports to the county board. So therefore, the county board should be making the appointment on this as the county administrator. It follows structure, it follows process. And that's why I think why the Personnel Policy Committee decided to do this. I don't necessarily think the intention was here because someone was running or not running or whatever the case may be, but more importantly, it's the structure. The county administrator now reports directly to the county board. Therefore, the county board should be the ones to appoint who the next county administrator would be. That's how I view it. That's how I see it. And in that case, that's why I'm supporting this on this aspect of it.
I'm confused because it's not a technical point. It's actually a mechanism that is about government. Is the county board would not be making the appointment. The county board would be making the approval as they do currently. The Personnel and Policy Committee would be making the appointment. And that, I'm not saying that what you said was inaccurate. I'm just drawing a distinction that currently the county board approves the hire, fire, dismissal of a county administrator currently, and then going forward, regardless of this change or not, that it would be the Personnel Policy Committee under the direction of Mr. Fiducia as chairman who would make the appointment, not the county board. So I guess my point is a county board member on the Public Works Committee couldn't see that they're going to make an appointment. It would be through the Personnel and Policy Committee. I'm just making sure I'm understanding the points of how this is being laid out. Yes, sir.
From my perspective, the way I read it, the county board is selecting and appointing the person. Whether it comes, in this case, if Mr. Fiducia's policy and if finance wants to recommend, I can do so, whatever the case may be. But at the end of the day, the person that's going to appoint this is the county board as a whole. So I want you to understand that.
I'm just going to go to maybe Mr. Kurlinkus on this because I'm confused now because we've been down this road before about appointments. The appointment and approval are two different things, and I wouldn't want it to be misunderstood. Or if I'm misunderstanding this, how it's written, then I've been wrong before, and I'll own that. But there is a difference between the county board or any of the 20 county board members thinking that the county board makes an appointment because somebody makes a decision to recommend it on the agenda, and that's kind of a big distinction when you go to execute this versus a committee making a recommendation. I'm making sure I'm asking Mr. Kurlinkus a question so that I understand. Mr. Webster, you do not have the floor. I want to ask Mr. Kurlinkus to clarify this. Mr. Webster, I heard your concern. I'm going to Mr. Kurlinkus to confirm and clarify this. I think it's an important distinction so there's no confusion. Mr. Kurlinkus.
I'm not sure exactly what, I mean, the ordinance is pretty clear. It's a short ordinance. I'm not sure what the question is. The recommendation comes through the Policy and Personnel Committee, but the appointment, discipline, or dismissal is done by the county board.
That's why I say it. Not what it says. It does not say that. It says
So I'm going
Personnel and Policy.
let me go back in fairness to Mr. Salgado. I'll go back to Mr. Salgado. He had his hand up. Then we'll take any other questions. Mr. Salgado.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think every single person on, whether it's the policies and personnel, finance, those are all county board members. The distinction is the chairman's not doing the appointment on this. It's the county board that's doing the appointment. All right? It's saying the chairman is not, it's replacing it with the county board. That's essentially what's happening here. I don't know if that makes sense to you or it doesn't make sense to you. And that's literally what this is telling you. Unless Mr. Fiducia or Mr. Boomer, whoever drafted this, wants to explain it, and I think he had his hand up.
Yeah.
He can elaborate on that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Salgado. Mr. Fellers, or Mr. Fiducia, would you like to speak to this? Then I have Mr. Fellers.
I'll yield to Mr. Boomer, I think.
I'm going to go to Mr. Fellers, and then we'll go to Mr. Boomer.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Jaime was saying. I was just trying to make it like a Cliff Notes, but he was more articulate, so I'll bow down to his definition.
Mr. Webster.
Please.
We have a motion to call the question. May I have a second on calling the question, which would end discussion? I have Mr. Westcott on the second to call the question, which would end the discussion and debate. We have a motion and a second to call the question. I'll ask the clerk to call the roll. A yes vote will call the question and end debate. A no vote will allow the debate to continue on this matter. Clerk Gamo.
Mr. Butita? Yes. Mrs. Crosby?
No.
Mr. Fellers?
No.
Mr. Fiducia?
Yes.
Mr. Gurl?
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Kelly?
Yes.
Mr. McDonald?
No.
Mr. Neighbors?
No.
Mrs. Red?
Yes.
Mr. Salgado?
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni?
Yes.
Mr. Webster?
Yes.
Mr. Westcott?
Yes.
Mr. Arena?
No.
Mr. Billich?
Yes.
Mr. Boomer? Mr. Booker?
No.
Thirteen yeas. 6 noes.
So we have 13 yeses to end the discussion. That will end debate on this matter, and then I will ask the clerk to call the roll on this ordinance. The ordinance is to have the Personnel and Policy Committee appoint and the county board approve the county administrator. So a yes vote would make that change in the ordinance. A no vote would leave it as status quo. Mrs. Gorel. Oh, we've ended discussion.
No, I know that, but you need to rephrase that because that committee would only recommend and then the county board would vote.
That would
They
go
would
through the
not
Personnel
appoint.
Policy
They
Committee.
would not appoint, they would recommend.
We will agree, since we've ended discussion, we'll agree to disagree, and I will ask the clerk to call the roll. A yes vote would adopt this, a no vote would not. We have ended discussion, so there cannot be any more discussion on this matter.
Mrs. Crosby? No. Mr. Fellers?
No.
Mr. Fiducia?
Yes.
Mr. Gurl?
No.
Mrs. Gorel?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Kelly?
No.
Mr. McDonald?
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors?
No.
Mrs. Red?
Yes.
Mr. Salgado?
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni?
Yes.
Mr. Webster?
Yes.
Mr. Westcott?
Yes.
Mr. Arena?
Yes.
Mr. Billich? Mr. Boomer? Mr. Booker?
No.
Mr. Butita?
No.
That's 12 yays. And 7 noes.
Motion passes 12-7. We've adopted the ordinance change. Mr. Fiducia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A public body may hold a closed meeting to consider the following subjects: appointment, employment, compensation, discipline, performance, or dismissal of specific employees. The public body or legal counsel for both public bodies, including hearing testimony, complaints lodged against employees, of the public body or against legal counsel for the public body to determine its validity. Litigation, when there's actions affecting the behalf of the particular public body, has been filed and pending before the court or administrative tribunal. When the public body finds the action probable and imminent, which in case the basis for finding shall be recorded, the entire minutes of the closed session. At this time, Mr. Chairman, I would like to make a motion to go into closed session.
We have a motion by Mr. Fiducia to go to closed session to discuss personnel. I have a second by Mrs. Gorel. With that, I will ask the clerk to call the roll. A yes vote goes to closed session, a no vote stays in open.
Mr. Fellers?
No.
Mr. Fiducia?
Yes.
Mr. Gurl?
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Kelly?
No.
Mr. McDonald? Absent. Mr. Neighbors?
Yes.
Mrs. Red?
Yes.
Mr. Salgado?
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni?
Yes.
Mr. Webster? Mr. Westcott?
Yes.
Mr. Arena?
Yes.
Mr. Billich?
Yes.
Mr. Boomer?
Yes.
Mr. Booker?
No.
Mr. Butita?
No.
Mrs. Crosby?
No.
And I missed Mr. McDonald is
Still not rested.
okay, so he's
Absent.
absent. So that's one absent. 5 nays. So 13 yeas, 5 noes, 1 absent.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to go to closed session. We'll take a 2-minute break. We'll start up right away. 2 minutes. Back in open session, no action was taken in closed session. Mr. Fiducia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We just discussed personnel matters, and that concludes my report.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fiducia. Next item of business, Finance Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Finance Committee has no report today except the fact that Carla's team, the finance team and Carla are working on the budget. It looks like hopefully next week we'll have some numbers, projections on that, and hopefully have a Finance Committee for that. So just want to make everybody aware of that. That's coming down the pipeline. And I know that there's a couple questions about tax levies and stuff like that, which we'll probably address as a whole board. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Salgado. Next item of business, Zoning Committee. Mr. Webster.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. We don't have anything on our zoning committee, and we won't have anything for a month, at least, because the two applicants that they had for zoning board of appeals, one asked for a layover and one might pull the pin altogether. And so consequently, I won't have to have a zoning committee meeting this month either. So you won't hear nothing from us till next month. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Webster. Mr. McDonald, Operations Committee.
No report.
Thank you very much. Public Works Committee, Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have no report.
Any unfinished business? Under new business, I do have one quick item, and I see a hand up. We have the reappointment of Howie Heaton to the Rockford Area Venues and Entertainment Authority, otherwise known as RAVE, which covers the McChesney Park area appointment from June of 19 through June of 2024. It's a 5-year term, and that's being read in. That is being read in this evening. Mr. Westcott?
Yes, I'd like to make a motion. We pass this tonight.
So we got a motion by Mr. Westcott, thank you, to suspend the rules to allow us to vote this evening. The motion by Mr. Westcott, second by Mr. Hoffman to suspend. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? Motion passes. With that, we've suspended the rules. I'll go to Mr. Westcott.
Yes. I recommend Howie Heaton for this position.
So we got a motion by Mr. Westcott to approve Howie Heaton to the RAVE Board for another term. May I have a second, please? Mr. Hoffman, thank you. That is now before the board. Any comments or questions on this reappointment to the RAVE Board? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes. I do not have an appointment of an acting county administrator this evening, so we can pull that item. Are there any other items under new business? Mr. or Mrs. Crosby?
I'm going to present a resolution to go to operations sponsored by John Butita, Aaron Booker, Keith McDonald, Gene Crosby, Dan Fellers, and Dave Kelly. The resolution dissolving the Personnel and Policy Committee with all duties and responsibilities to be divided between operations and public safety.
So we have a motion.
No,
We have a new business item that'll be referred to the Operations Committee.
Correct.
And can you repeat what that is again? That was
The
long-winded.
dissolution of personnel and policies, and that those duties be divided between operations and administration and public safety.
And you're referring that to the Operations Committee for
Correct.
for discussion?
Correct.
Okay, so that'll be referred. Mr. Boomer. Thank you, Mrs. Crosby. Mr. Boomer.
I'd like clarification from the state's attorney, even if they can bring forward something like that. Ludicrous.
Is your question whether or not a dissolution of a committee can occur with board approval, with majority board approval?
Exactly.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Boomer. I'll go to Mr. Kurlinkus on how a committee is dissolved by the board.
With all due respect, in my 10 years here, this is the first time this has come up, so I would like to have a little time to research the matter, if that would be okay with the board.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kurlinkus. Thank you very much. We have no other items under new business.
Motion to adjourn.
Motion by Mr. Fellers to adjourn. Oh, I'll go back to Mr. I'm going to ask everybody for their attention. Mr. Webster has the floor. Mr. Webster.
Still under new business?
We are under new business, sir.
Thank you. Okay, this matter of administration leaving, it's a matter of the administrator leaving. Now, if that happens, then we would need an interim administrator to fill that role while we conducted a search for an administrator, okay? So I've been doing some background work on this and lots of phone calls and so forth. First of all, I will say this to you. As an interim administrator, there's absolutely no one that I can possibly think of, and it'd be hard to argue against, a man that's done that for 26 years for the county, and that would be Steve Chapman. I've had some long conversations with Mr. Chapman, and I asked him, would he be interested in fulfilling that role on an interim basis while we do a search? And without hesitation, he said yes. And so the next day I was talking to another political active person there, and I mentioned that, and they said, no, I don't think he would do that. I said, well, maybe I was dreaming. Called him back the next day, we had the same conversation. Was I dreaming, Steve? No. He said, I'm there for you. I'm there for the county. The guy had done it for 26 years. There's really not anything about county government that he doesn't know. I cannot think of anyone that could step into that role easier than Steve Chapman. I asked him also, Steve, knowing that our administrator is going to leave August 2nd, how much time would you need? And he said, not much, Jim. He said, maybe 3-4 days. I said, 3 or 4 days, that's it? He said, yep. He said, okay, a week then. So that's all he would need. The point is there, anyone else whose name has been bandied about to come in to be a temporary administrator doesn't have the knowledge or the background. They would need so much help, they would have to come in starting tomorrow to learn even 1/4 of what Mr. Chapman already knows. So he would need 2 or 3 days to get caught up with what the administrator is currently doing with the budget. Now, as far as the search, if it comes to that, the search firm GovHR USA, I've spoke to the people that run that. They did the search in the first place for Ms. Pascal. And so I looked at the work that they had done and the resume and so forth, and it's so complete, it's hard to fault anything. So all I'm asking there is if there are others interested in doing a search, I want to see what their qualifications and experience, their resume is. When GovHR did this, and it got to our Finance Committee and Operations Administrative Committee, this is in 2016, there's the document there, and everyone agreed to GovHR, to hire GovHR unanimously. So there was no argument on the quality of their work. So I've had several conversations with them as well. And they are more than happy to help us if it comes down to a search. A 3-way search, as Keith has suggested, for HR, CFO, and administrator. They could handle all of those. And in all those other roles, this company also provides it. They're nationwide now. This company also can provide interim administrators, interim HR directors, and interim CFOs. Highly qualified people. This is a very professional company. So I could add some more to this, maybe embellish it more, but to that end, I've asked Jaime Salgado, he's chair of finance, and I asked Keith McDonald, who's chair of operations, if they would join me, and if our fellow board, and they agreed, and if our fellow board members would allow us to kind of, she said, more than happy to come to town, sit before us or a full committee, or the full board even. And I want to ask that of any other potential companies as well that would be interested in doing this. And so what I'm asking of my fellow board members, these two fellows agreed with me to allow us just to be, I don't know what you want to call us, our point people on this, maybe the search squad, search team. I hesitate to use the word committee, but if you would allow us to do that, garner any information, get people to come to town and talk to us.
I see a couple hands popped up. Mr. McDonald?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do share Mr. Webster's enthusiasm with using a professional source to find a most qualified candidate. My hope is to use a company from within inside Winnebago County, because nobody's going to care about Winnebago County as much as the people who are from here. But I think we're going down similar paths in the fact that I welcome the professional's input on doing a qualified talent search that reaches as far as we need to get the right person. I think this is an exciting thing.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. I saw another hand up. I believe Mr. Butito.
Thank you. I concur with Mr. McDonald. We do have some talent in this community, and I would like to at least have that talent the opportunity to bid on that process.
Okay. Thank you very much. Any other hands? Mrs. Redd, sorry.
Thank you, Chairman. I need all of you to go back and look at that memo. The memo said, "It is my intention to resign on August 2nd. Go back and read the memo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Rudd. Any other comments, questions? Yes, Mr. McDonald.
It is my intention to accept her memo.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. With that, I would entertain a motion to adjourn. Got a motion by Mr. Boomer, second by Mr. Reno. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Have a good night. Thank you.